The story we've long told about the birth of civilization is simple, comforting, and wrong. According to the Standard Model, sometimes called the Agriculture First Hypothesis, humans began domesticating plants around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent to ensure a stable supply of food. This marked the end of the nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle and the beginning of permanent settlements. The assumption was clear. More calories meant more people meant complexity, and complexity meant cities, writing, and eventually, civilization. It's a neat narrative. Everything fits perfectly. No room for other interpretations. Or is there? What if it misses the point entirely? What if the spark was different? Not food, but fermentation. That's the radical suggestion behind what's now called the beer before bread hypothesis. First proposed in academic form by archaeologist Jonathan Sauer in the 1950s and later expanded upon by Solomon Katz and Mary Voigt in a pivotal 1986 paper published in Expedition. They argued that the earliest domestication of cereals like barley and wheat may have been driven not by hunger, but by the desire to brew beer. In their view, fermentation wasn't a side effect of agriculture, it was the cause. The idea sounded absurd to many, but it refused to die. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Why would humans across continents and millennia go out of their way to seek out something that impairs coordination, blurs vision, and leaves you vulnerable? Because long before alcohol was a ritual, a problem, or a party, it was a signal. Ethanol is produced when yeast consumes sugar, and for primates living in dense competitive ecosystems, the scent of fermentation didn't mean intoxication, it meant calories. It meant fruit at peak ripeness. It meant survival. This is the core of the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis, first proposed by biologist Robert Dudley. He argued that our ancestors evolved a natural attraction to alcohol because it reliably led them to high-energy food. Fermented fruit gives off ethanol vapor, and those who were better at detecting it through scent, taste, or even craving were more likely to find food before it spoiled or was taken by something else. Over time, natural selection didn't punish the attraction to alcohol, it favored it. That's the proposal he made when publishing his paper back in 2000, Fermenting Fruit and the Evolution of Ethanol Ingestion, a pilot study of the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis, published in Chemical Senses. Dudley argued that the human attraction to alcohol wasn't cultural, it was biological. But here's where things get weird. If humans are, in essence, drunk monkeys with bigger brains, then our relationship to alcohol is deeper than indulgence. It's ancestral. If Dudley and Katz were right, then the fermented buzz wasn't a party trick. It was a survival tool, a motivator, a catalyst. And suddenly, the archaeological record starts to look very different. Maybe humans didn't begin farming to feed the village. Maybe they farmed so they could get wasted. That's what we're about to talk about in this video. The Stone Age Speakeasy. The oldest temples in the world weren't built beside farms. They were built beside vats. At the southeastern edge of modern-day Turkey lies Göbekli Tepe, a site that shattered everything we thought we knew about early civilization. Dating to roughly 11,500 years ago, thousands of years before the first cities or widespread agriculture, it consists of towering limestone pillars carved with vultures, scorpions, wild boars, and other animals. These weren't shelters. They weren't granaries. They were monuments, places of gathering. And yet, no permanent homes surround them. So, why build them? Among the stone circles, archaeologists discovered 6 massive limestone basins, each capable of holding between 160 and 200 liters of liquid. That's at least 960 liters of liquid, and 1,200 liters at most. When tested, they showed signs of calcium oxalate, one of the telltale residues left behind by fermented grain mash. That's the scientific term for beer. First of all, that's an impressive amount of liquid for people who still had 7,500 years to go before inventing the wheel. And second, this wasn't just a brewery tucked into a settlement. The ritual space was the brewery. Similar clues appear across the globe. It seems all around, the world found various and inventive ways to make booze out of pretty much anything they got their hands on. In Rockafet Cave, in what's now Israel, scientists found 13,000-year-old grooves carved into bedrock, lined with starch granules and signs of yeast. Analyzed under microscope, these residues matched what you'd expect from a primitive brewing process: malting, grinding, and fermenting cereals. The people who made them belonged to the Natufian culture, a group that occupied the blurry threshold between foraging and farming. They didn't yet farm wheat, but for sure they brewed with it. Even earlier, at Zhuahu in China, ceramic shards dating back 9,000 years carried the faint chemical fingerprints of a cocktail made from rice, honey, and wild fruit, a kind of Stone Age mead-wine hybrid. Biomolecular archaeologists, including Patrick McGovern, often dubbed the Indiana Jones of ancient alcohol, which is, by the way, one of the coolest titles you could get pretty much in the whole history of mankind. Well, he used chromatography and mass spectrometry to confirm the presence of tartaric acid, beeswax, and other fermentation markers. All of these sites have a striking commonality that backs up the Drunken Monkey theory. They weren't long-term farming settlements, but they were places where people gathered and where they brewed. The traditional narrative says that people gathered because they had begun farming, but this evidence flips the equation. Maybe people began farming because they were already gathering, for ritual, for community, and for the intoxicating experience that alcohol made possible. It's not that beer came after bread. It may have come first. Why booze mattered more than bread. So why is beer, or whatever alcohol they were cooking, more important than securing bread? People may have had enough to eat already. What they lacked was enough alcohol for 10,000 people to get absolutely trashed at the same time. Fermentation doesn't just produce alcohol, it produces emotion. Sort of. From a biochemical perspective, ethanol is a social accelerant. Once it enters the bloodstream, it reduces fear responses by acting on GABA receptors, the main synaptic inhibitors, exerting inhibitory effects through the second messenger system. Consequently, it elevates dopamine levels in the reward circuitry and promotes oxytocin release, the so-called bonding hormone, thus setting in motion neurological mechanisms that create trust, dissolve tension if everything goes well, and triggers feelings of collective joy. In small doses, alcohol doesn't dull the brain, it focuses it on the group. That matters, because early humans were social mammals trapped in a paradox. We needed to cooperate in larger groups than other primates, but we lacked the genetic uniformity or built-in hierarchies that make group cohesion easy. We needed a bridge, something that could link individuals into a collective. Alcohol may have been that bridge. Culture and other factors could have been as well, but there's tons of micro-examples today where people belong to the same culture and still don't get along enough to spend an entire day in the same room. The evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar has written extensively about the cognitive limits of social group size, what's now called Dunbar's number. To simplify, it's the typical number of people we can keep track of and consider part of our ongoing social circle. If you're curious about it, the exact number he mentioned is 150 people total. The 5 first being our close friends, 15 first being the superfamily, 50 and under into what's referred to as the clan, and all belonging to the 150, aka the tribe. And if you were wondering, social media has not increased that number at all, despite our capacity to talk to pretty much anyone, anytime. But more interestingly, Dunbar argues that as language emerged, so did new ways to bond across larger groups, such as music, laughter, and drinking. In a 2016 paper titled Adaptive Human Behavior and Physiology, he even suggested that alcohol functioned as an artificial grooming tool, a scalable replacement for the face-to-face intimacy that once held tribes together. In this light, alcohol becomes a proto-technology, making alcoholics of the time the first nerds. It helped us relax, but not only. It also greatly helped us to remember each other. I know this sounds kind of paradoxical in some cases. Trust each other and build rituals that extended beyond bloodlines. It fostered what cognitive scientists call collective intentionality, the ability to believe in shared fictions, coordinate over abstract goals, and build symbolic systems. And that's what separates a one-time gathering from a society. So when we see 11,000-year-old sites filled with giant animal carvings and brewing pits, but no fields, it might not be an oversight. It might be a clue. These weren't just drinking parties. They were sacred events, feasts, funerals, origin myths in motion. And to sustain them, people needed something that could be stored, transported, and shared. Not meat, not even bread. Grain. Not for food, for feeling. The agricultural arms race. And so when you consider all of this, that makes farming activities side effects. Domestication would just be a nice add-on to get more grain, but not just any grain, the most productive kind, the one that tastes the best, be it for alcohol or for bread. For generations, humans had gathered wild cereals like barley and einkorn, but wild grains are inconsistent, climate-dependent, region-specific, and seasonally unreliable. That's a problem if you're trying to host a ritual every year with beer at the center. You can't trust the gods to show up if the yeast can't. So what do? You start planting, just to make sure you got enough for the party, but not to eat, at least not until enough grain is secured for the gathering. As Solomon Katz and Mary Voigt argued in 1986, the earliest evidence of grain processing appears in contexts that make more sense for brewing than baking. Mortars, grinding stones, soaking pits, none of them optimized for flour, all of them perfect for malt. Their paper, Bread and Beer, the early use of cereals in the human diet, proposed that agriculture may have originated as a brewing solution, not a dietary one. And while this makes sense, people were eating way before agriculture. They didn't need to go through something so hard as to plant, plow the soils, and so on to get food. So why would they decide to do it in the first place? And the deeper the research goes, the stranger the evidence becomes. At Chayanu, a pre-agricultural site in southeastern Turkey, grinding tools and vats appear before widespread use of ovens. In Wadi Kubanaya in Egypt, ancient barley starch residues suggest fermentation predating full-time farming. Even in Ain Malaha, a 14,000-year-old Natufian village, stone mortars align better with beer making than food preparation. None of these places show consistent year-round ground cultivation, but they all suggest one thing. People were going out of their way to make booze before they were going out of their way to make food. That raises a counterintuitive question. In our specific case, what was more evolutionarily powerful? A full belly or a full gathering? Calories keep you alive, but communion keeps you human. Thinking about tomorrow and coming up with a solution. A healthy competition or cooperation. Ritual drinking forged alliances, sealed marriages, ended disputes, and reified shared myth. It turned strangers into kin and myth into memory. To keep that magic going, people needed grain. Not to survive the day, but to anchor the year. The result wasn't a clear decision. It was probably a slow drift. Small cereal pots became necessary. Storage became needed to not lose the results of the harvest to rodents. Selective planting began, choosing grains with tougher husks, larger seeds, and synchronous ripening. Bit by bit, farming emerged. Not from scarcity, but from abundance. Not to survive, but to gather again. Civilization in this view wasn't born in the field. It was brewed in the basin. Intoxication as Infrastructure. The birth of civilization wasn't just about calories or tools. It was about ritual. Early humans needed shared emotional experiences to anchor their societies. Before law, before gods had names, before myth was written down, we needed to feel together. At least to grow further than the small forager groups already in place. To share awe, grief, belonging. And fermentation, chemical, chaotic, unpredictable, offered a shortcut into that space. Archaeologist Ian Hodder, who excavated Kalahaliak, often described early settlements not as practical hubs, but as emotional ones. Homes weren't just places to eat or sleep, they were ritual centers. Bones under floors, skulls mounted on walls. Human remains arranged in ways that suggest more than disposal. They suggest meaning. People were surrounded by the dead as much as they were by the living. Hodder's broader theory from 2012, entanglement, proposes that humans became caught in webs of dependency, not just with technology and food, but with the emotions those tools made possible. Fermentation may have been the emotional engine behind that entanglement. The altered states it produced were not distractions, they were glue. When enough people gathered, singing, dancing, drinking, their identities blurred. Neuroscientists call this collective effervescence, a term coined by sociologist Emil Durkheim to describe the group high that emerges during shared rituals. It creates a sense of transcendence, of becoming more than oneself. That kind of experience doesn't just feel good. It legitimizes power, myth, and memory. You don't question the ritual that made you cry. You return to it. And over time, the places where these rituals happened, once temporary, became fixed. Monuments went up. Symbols repeated. The emotional rhythm of gathering began to carve itself into the land. This is where we start to see true infrastructure. At sites like Chogamami and Tel Abu Hureru, archaeologists find grain silos, drain systems, and brewing vats arranged in ways that suggest ceremonial flow. In ancient Mesopotamia, temple breweries weren't site buildings, they were central. In Sumerian hymns, beer is described as a gift of the gods, a liquid worthy of sacrifice. In Old Greek myth, much later, ambrosia is described as the nectar of the gods. Even the oldest written texts, like the hymn to Ninkasi, a Sumerian beer recipe dated to around 1800 BCE, combined brewing instructions with prayer. There was no hard line between industry and religion. The buzz was the blessing. It wasn't that early humans drank because they had nothing better to do. It's that drinking done right became what they had to do. A ritual act, a social contract, a binding force. Intoxication wasn't the side effect of civilization. It was the source code. When the party ended. But rituals don't stay wild forever. Except for Burning Man, apparently. As villages became cities and cities became states, the open-air feast gave way to bureaucracy. What began as collective joy became institutional control. Elites realized that the same substance that once unified the tribe could now regulate people's whereabouts and even build dependency. In ancient Sumer, beer was no longer just brewed, it was taxed, distributed, and documented. Cuneiform tablets list rations of beer given to temple workers, soldiers, and even slaves. In Uruk, the world's first large city, entire administrative departments were dedicated to tracking grain and beer flow. It wasn't sacred spontaneity anymore. It was ledger entries and quotas. Where once anyone might brew, now it was the domain of temples and palaces. Once again, the elites seized the most valued resources and made something once common an exclusive delicacy. Sociologist Max Weber described this shift as the transition from charismatic authority to rational legal authority. Rituals lose their emotional immediacy. They become institutional tools. And alcohol, once the facilitator of egalitarian ecstasy, became a managed substance, both feared and exploited. This duality spread across empires. In ancient Egypt, beer was considered essential to the afterlife, included in tomb offerings and consumed by the living daily. But its production and distribution were tightly controlled by the state. In China, Shang dynasty rulers performed rice wine sacrifices to their ancestors, but commoners caught drinking outside sanctioned rituals could be punished. And in some cultures, the shift was even harsher. Among early Indo-European societies, the divine mead of the poets became a class divider. Who could drink, when, and how became expressions of hierarchy. The same is true in Mesoamerica, where pulque, a sacred agave brew, was reserved for priests, nobles, and the elderly. Drunkenness among commoners was banned except during sanctioned festivals, and even then under strict rules. In other words, the party didn't stop. It was commandeered. Fermentation had built the emotional infrastructure of early human society, But now that infrastructure was fenced off, managed, and weaponized, ritual became ritualism. Ecstasy became ceremony. And where alcohol once dissolved boundaries, it now reinforced them. The sacred buzz was still there, but it was behind a velvet rope, tightly guarded. And if you wanted in, you had to pay. The yeast in our blood. But even after alcohol lost its sacred uniform, it never left our bodies. Across continents, our genes tell a hidden story. We didn't just drink because we found it funny. We adapted to drink. And that adaptation runs deep. Humans produce an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase, or ADH in short, which helps break down ethanol in the liver. But not all ADH is created equal. Genetic studies show that distinct populations, East Asians, Europeans, Africans, develop different versions of this enzyme, independently, in parallel, over thousands of years. That's not coincidence, that's evolution. A particularly well-studied mutation, ADH1B, 47His, allows for much faster processing of alcohol. It's most common in East Asian populations and likely emerged 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, around the time rice fermentation was becoming widespread. The trait appears to have undergone positive selection, meaning individuals who could tolerate alcohol had a reproductive advantage, according to a 2007 study from Lee et al. In Nature Genetics. Meanwhile, in Europe, a different kind of adaptation occurred. As early farmers began consuming large amounts of beer and mead, the ability to detoxify alcohol more efficiently helped offset the risk of long-term liver damage and ethanol-related nutrient deficiencies. These changes weren't cultural. They were carved into the genome thanks to heavy use of the substance. People who could withstand such consumption without suffering long-term disease could have more children, hence the selection. Even our gut bacteria got in on the act. Recent studies have found that alcohol-tolerant microbiomes co-evolved with human drinking habits. Populations with a long history of fermentation, like those in West Africa, the Caucasus, and the Andes, tend to host more ethanol-resistant microbes. It's as if our entire biological ecosystem was optimized not just to survive intoxication, but incorporated into daily life. So no, alcohol wasn't just an occasional treat. It was a persistent force, one powerful enough to leave fingerprints in our DNA. We didn't just enjoy it, we were shaped by it. And if that sounds strange, remember, we see the same evolutionary story with other dietary revolutions. Lactase persistence, milk. Amylase June duplication, starch. Alcohol just got there first. We weren't designed for beer. We became designed by it. What brewed us into being? In the end, alcohol didn't just touch human history, it fermented it. Fermentation was never simply about getting drunk, it was about transformation. Of grain into drink, of strangers into kin, of chaos into ritual. It turned perishable plants into portable meaning. It let people preserve calories and create culture in the same stroke. The idea that such a substance could shape civilization might seem absurd, until you step back and look at the pattern. Alcohol is present at the dawn of agriculture, as in Göbekli Tepe. It appears in the world's first written languages, like the beer rations on Sumerian clay tablets. It seeps into the earliest laws, myths, and metaphysics, linked to gods, sacrifice, fertility, and fate. It reemerges again and again in nearly every ancient society as a central axis of ritual life. That doesn't happen by accident. Biologist Patrick McGovern, who spent decades analyzing ancient alcohol residues, put it bluntly. No other plant product has had such a profound impact on human biology and culture. In his book, Uncorking the Past, he traces a global arc, from Stone Age beers to imperial wines to sacred spirits, arguing that humanity's oldest chemical obsession is also its most enduring civilizing force. Why? Because alcohol is a social technology, a biochemical spell. It gives structure to emotion, rhythm to memory, and flavor to belief. It helps humans move from isolation to integration, from instinct to intention. And that's the very essence of culture. No single force explains why humans became what we are, but alcohol, in its strange and sticky way, may have acted as the starter yeast, a catalyst that turned gatherings into ceremonies, ceremonies into settlements, and settlements into civilizations. It didn't feed us, it connected us. And from those first shared cups under flickering firelight, we began to imagine worlds beyond hunger. We began to dream. We didn't just domesticate grain. We domesticated the feeling it gave us. The warm humming blur between the self and the collective. That thing we now call culture. But even though it seems like it enabled us to transcend our way of life, it slowly drifted into a societal health issue. When the buzz became a burden. For most of human history, alcohol was hard to make, hard to store, and almost impossible to overconsume. It was brewed in small batches, shared in ritual contexts, and diluted with water, herbs, or grain. Even when people drank regularly, they did so communally, anchored in celebration, tradition, or grief. Fermentation was tied to rhythm, harvest, solstice, burial, birth. It had meaning. But meaning doesn't always scale. Something changed as human societies grew. Alcohol got stronger, cheaper, and more available. Ritual turned into routine. Scarcity turned into surplus. And the drink that once brought us together began to split us apart. At least, some of us. The tipping point came in stages. First, in the ancient world, techniques improved. Mesopotamians filtered and clarified their beers. Egyptians refined wine. Chinese alchemists began distilling small amounts of high-proof alcohol as early as 800 CE. But it was in the Middle Ages with the rise of full distillation that the game changed. No longer limited to 4 to 6% alcohol by volume, humans could now produce drinks with 30, 40, even 90% ABV, and they could do it fast. For the first time in history, it became easier to drink a week's worth of calories than to eat them, and the context had changed too. Where alcohol was once confined to feast days and sacred spaces, now it flowed daily. In cities with contaminated water, like Renaissance London or 80th century Paris, beer and wine were safer to drink than river water. At least you avoided cholera. In colonial America, children drank diluted cider with breakfast. In industrial Britain, gin became the cheapest anesthetic for labor and poverty. It wasn't sacred anymore. It was necessary. Or at least unavoidable. By the 18th century, chronic alcohol use was no longer rare, it was generational. The same substance that once dissolved tribal boundaries was now dissolving bodies, families, and futures. Addiction, a word that barely existed in ancient languages, had become public concern. By the 19th century, it had a name, and by the 20th, it had a medical diagnosis. But the roots weren't evil, just old. Alcoholism didn't begin because people suddenly became weak. It began because our ancient reward systems, wired for scarcity, designed to chase fruit and fermentation, were suddenly overwhelmed by abundance. Our bodies had evolved to handle a few drinks here and then. Now they were drowning in the flood. And even today, that mismatch lingers. We drink for celebration, for stress, for sleep, for silence. We drink to remember, to forget, to feel connected, to feel numb, to feel something. And behind each reason is the same evolutionary echo. A memory of when alcohol was rare, sacred, and social. We're not broken. We're just carrying an ancient craving into a modern world that never stops pouring. Maybe we settled because we wanted to gather, to remember, to feel something together, and alcohol was how we got there. A drink that blurred the edges of the self, stirred the embers of myth, and made us feel less alone under the stars. It ended up having the opposite effect. More and more end up isolated from society, and ironically, alcohol has become such a part of our societies, and all of them, that we can hardly get rid of it, as shown by the Prohibition episode back in the 1930s US. Civilization wasn't just built on bricks and grain, it was built on shared illusions, sacred rituals, and yes, on fermented dreams. Now its foundations are crumbling thanks to addiction and abundance. If that sparked something in you, a new perspective, a question, a strange sense of deja vu, don't let it fade. Subscribe for more stories brewed in deep time. Like the video if it helps you see the past a little more clearly. Share it with someone who'd raise a cup to that first ancient toast. And drop a comment. Was alcohol our first technology of connection, or just the excuse we needed to come together? Your curiosity is what keeps these ideas alive. It's what helps them echo a little farther. Until next time, keep listening to the echoes.